Hi everybody, welcome to IS-323's lecture on sanctions. My name is Bill L. Smith. I'm the director of a couple of entities on campus in the Martin Institute and the Bora Foundation, and I'm a faculty member of the program in International Studies in the School of Global Studies. And it's my honor and privilege to talk to you today about sanctions. Sanctions, it's a bit of a different topic from what you've had so far in IS-323, which I'm sure you've deduced through the material so far. The class is about global economic governance. In this case, this is more about global governance through economics. And what happens is that entities like the United Nations or the European Union, countries like the United States or Russia or China or others, leverage economic activity or the prohibition of economic activity to try and get people, countries, or entities to behave in a certain way. So if these entities are acting outside the norms or contrary to the will of the states that have the ability to leverage sanctions, they close off access to economic trade, to lines of credit, to monetary reserves held in banks outside their own country, to all sorts of avenues of the global economy, and use that to try and force a change in the behavior of those states. And so that's why I'd say it's about global governance through economics as opposed to global economic governance. So this doesn't shift the way the economy works, except for who has access to it, but it does very much dictate who can play in the international economy. Now, something that interests me very much about sanctions is that they're a relatively recent phenomenon, that they've only been a dynamic part of the international system for just over 100 years. And that sanction use really rises after the end of World War I. But there's a 10-year period from 1919 to 1929 where they're used very differently than they're used after that. And what you really needed to have happen was sort of a conceptualization of the role that neutral countries could play. I'll show you about that in a minute, in a conflict. And a truly interconnected economic system that meant that one country's decisions or one organization's decisions about limiting another country's access to the economy could truly impact them. And that doesn't really work if the country has largely a self-contained economy. There aren't a lot of those in the world. There is one that's pretty close to self-contained in North Korea. And a lot of times when we as a global community try and limit their access to other lines of credit, it doesn't work very well because they don't use those systems as often. But it did require this change in concept. And so let me start with the first one, which is considering the way force was used. So if you go before the Great War, World War I, there were lots of declarations of war that were issued by a sovereign. So some leader somewhere issued statements about why they were about to undertake war. And these are the most common ones. There's an interesting manifesto database that Yale University maintains. It's got all the manifestos from that time period. And one of the things you find is that several things related to the economy are on there that may justify war, but they justified war, the physical action of invading or attacking or using force against another country. And so there were lots of reasons for war that gave what the country considered just reasons for them to invade. This is different from what Jesuits and other thinkers parse through to try and figure out what they would consider a just war is. But in this case, the just war is justifying a country going to war. It could be any of these things. And one of the things that's important when we start to talk about sanctions and why sanctions weren't used very often is conquest was acceptable, casualties were acceptable. You could use your military force to go and require a country to open its trade to you. The United States did it with Japan and Admiral Perry in the 1850s. We showed up with our steamships. We showed up with our military might and basically said, you're going to trade with us even though you don't want to, otherwise we're going to open fire. The West collectively did that to China. It happened to other places too. But one of the things that's peculiar about war in this period is that strict neutrality on the part of third countries was not just expected, but in a lot of cases required. So even if you didn't like what was happening, you were expected as a neutral to sit this one out. And what you'll find in the 20th and 21st century is that sanctions are a tool often used by neutral countries to get a belligerent in a conflict to behave. Okay, so what you're seeing, for example, right now with the West in regards to Russia's aggression in Ukraine is we're neutrals. We don't have a direct part in the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so in the old approach to war, we would be expected to maintain strict neutrality and just let them fight it out. And that the illegal part, we're talking about whether this is a legal war, or should Russia be held accountable, etc. And the consideration is that's true. In the old case, it wouldn't have been true. They had the right to do it. And in this case, then we wouldn't have been allowed to take action against Russia in the form of sanctions, because that would be violating the neutrality principle. So I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, but this concept that sanctions were basically banned. They weren't really a tool that was proposed very often. They did show up periodically throughout history, but neutral parties couldn't use it. During the war, the Great War, the First World War, a gentleman named Samuel Levinson decided to conceptualize a world where war was not permissible as a default position of national politics and national strategy and national aims, but that it was illegal, and that you should have laws forbidding war, and that encourage neutral states to be involved in a non-aggressive manner. So Levinson was looking for someone to adopt his ideas and promote them on a U.S. federal level and get them promoted through the United States legislative and executive branches, and then out into the world. And he found that in William Edgar Bora of Idaho. So I mentioned at the beginning, I direct something called the Bora Foundation at the University of Idaho. This is dedicated to understanding the causes of war and the conditions for peace in the international system. And it was funded by Salmon Levinson, who's from the previous slide, in honor of William Bora, who advocated this question about outlawing war. And he got it adopted in the executive branch, and leads to something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, or the Paris Peace Pact of the late 1920s. Now, what this does is several things, but one of them is that conquest gains aren't recognized. It basically prohibits the use of force. And so it doesn't prevent war, but it makes it so that war is not an acceptable part of your foreign policy, a de facto thing that you could do. It made it illegal, and that ends up meaning that up here, where you said that you were allowed unquestioned use of force, so you could conquer, you could have casualties, you could do gunboat diplomacy, and you had to be neutral, that after the fact, that conquest gains, if you go out against someone, we're not going to recognize it. If you have aggressive war, we're actually going to have war crimes and criminalize you. That you could respond to aggressive acts like the U.S. or someone in gunboat diplomacy showing up like we used to in the 19th century. And it also means that neutrals can levy sanctions and other means. It's an acceptable reaction to aggressive behavior. So in the big IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, what I mentioned was that there's a shift after the first 10 years to a different kind of conceptualization. So coming out of the First World War, the League of Nations talks specifically about sanctions in Article 16 of its covenant. So where the UN has a charter, the League had a covenant. And in Article 16, it proposes using sanctions not as a neutral party, but as an aggressive act. That you would actually, the conceptualization here is, you're going to tighten down access to economic to trade, to credit, to money, so that you get countries close to bankruptcy and you get the populace mad at their own governments and they force a change. In other words, it's not just sort of a deterrent, it's an aggressive push. And it is much more in keeping then with this old war concept, right, where you're going to meet force with force and you're going to hope to starve them out. It's a very aggressive sanctions regime that was conceptualized in the League of Nations. In the United Nations, under the Charter, Chapter 7, it is also to an extent aggressive, but it's more designed to deter than it is to force, like regime change. There is a hope that you're going to try and do something called smart sanctions. If you can, that there's always some suffering that is experienced by a populace when you close off access to economic avenues for a country. And there's sort of an evolving sense through the 20th into the 21st century that if it's possible that the sanctions that are levied should not punish the populace but punish the government or the regime that you're after. It's an attempt to not quite be as extreme as what the League tried. It's much more in keeping with the idea of neutrals leveraging sanctions as a way to get a person, a country, an entity to behave the way you want them to behave. Now, it is listed in the Charter as a step you can take against recalcitrant regimes that might lead to military action on the part of the United Nations. But it is a little bit different in terms of using these non-lethal means to get a country to behave. Now, since World War II, sanctions have been levied both multilaterally, in other words, by the United Nations, but also unilaterally by countries. And there's some bilateral and trilateral and other kinds of groups where you get a few states together. So the most common multilateral sanctions regimes come through the United Nations, whereas the most common unilateral sanctions come through the United States. We dig sanctions as a tool, and we use them often. So some of the readings we've assigned for this unit, one is to go through all the active U.S. sanctions regimes. And every time we offer this class, we'll update that list. You'll be able to see where the United States has its own sanctions, what they're designed to do, etc. And we'll also have, I don't think we'll be cruel enough to give you the entire list of nearly 1,000 sanctions that the UN has. The UN has sanctions against about 20 countries, but against more than 200 entities. So that could be organizations, it could be NGOs, it could be political parties, and it has more than 700 individuals that it has sanctions against. We have sanctions against individuals as well, but that's what it is. So they're applied pretty broadly and more commonly all the time. Now, one of the reasons we're able to apply them more commonly all the time is for the second reason from the slide right back here. And so for them to be effective, you need to have both the neutrals able to leverage them, so they're not direct participants in a conflict, but you also need to have that economy more tightly linked than it was previously, because only through the linkages of the economy can you really impact it. For example, so that's access to money, access to credit, access to support, to loans, to favorable interest rates, to trade, to parts for your factories. So the more linked the global economy, the more painful sanctions can be. So we have several questions that remain, and one of them is where they apply and how people might get around them. For example, if the U.S. has sanctions against a country and it prohibits U.S. companies from trading with someone, and the U.S. company may have offices in a couple of U.S. states, say the offices are in Idaho and Washington, that clearly limits the ability of those entities from trading or doing business with the sanctioned country. But if there's a secondary or tertiary headquarters registered in another country, does it prohibit them as well? Or do you have to pass a sanctions regime that says anybody, like we did this with Cuba at one point, where we said, we're not just banning U.S. companies, we're banning companies that do business with U.S. companies from doing business with Cuba. And so the way they're written up can leave loopholes that may or may not be intentional. Who's impacted? We mentioned that a little bit earlier. That's, our citizens affected. For example, in the 1990s and early 2000s, before the second Gulf War, when we went in to topple Saddam Hussein, the world wanted to sanction Hussein, but they wanted people to get food and medicine. So they made a deal where Hussein could sell just enough oil on the global market to earn enough money to import food and medicines. And they tried to manage that sort of sanctions. It didn't work very well. Saddam did okay for himself. Are they for deterrence or not? There's some question about what we're trying to do in Russia. Vice President Harris said it's for deterrence. President Biden said it's not. What if you need their stuff? Russia takes our people to the International Space Station. We need some of their uranium. Like, how do you really sanction a place you need their things, etc.? So there's lots of stuff that's still unanswered that we have to figure out, and so do you.